Hello, I'm Annie Graham Larkin, Executive Director of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. Welcome to Live on Stage, Entertainment in Early Bisbee with Mike Anderson. Thank you to our program sponsor, the Arizona Historical Society, as well as our members and donors who enable the museum to provide free online programming and fulfill the organization's mission to discover history, explore Bisbee's past today. To learn how you can assist the museum in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit bisbeemuseum.org. This year, the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum has designated the month of June to invite Bisbee residents to visit the museum free of charge. Show your driver's license confirming your residency to experience the fun of discovering history at the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. The museum is open daily from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. All right. Mike Anderson is the author of Warren Ballpark, a work that delves into the rich history of the playing field. He is also the historian and founding member of Friends of the Warren Ballpark in Bisbee. He has published numerous articles in the Journal of Arizona History and the Cochise County Journal of History. In addition, he is a performer himself and is a character and writer on the Farm and Ranch Report, a comedy radio show on Bisbee's local radio station, KBRP. And if you would like to ask questions during the program today, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll gather those questions to share with Mike after the presentation. Also, a link to today's recording will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome you, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for permitting me to be on your speaker series this year, and it's a delight to be able to share this information about entertainment in early Bisbee with you and everybody else that's here today. And what we'd like to do, just to start off, is to give you an idea as far as what kind of entertainment was available to people in early Bisbee. And we're going to be talking about a period from about 1895 to about 1915. And it's going to cover time from, well, here comes my assistant. It's going to cover it from when Bisbee first became a modern industrialized city and how it became connected to the rest of the world, and how the rest of the world provided it with quality entertainment. It is amazing, truly amazing, to think of Bisbee as being one of the venues for some of the top entertainers in the whole country. And I think you'll be surprised too to see how many people came here and what kind of entertainment they provided. So let's just start. So we all know that Bisbee was a pretty rough place when it started as a mining camp in the late 1870s and early 1880s. And like all mining camps of its time, it was a mostly male population, mostly young adult male population, and had very little in terms of civil society. A few stores and restaurants, not much in the way of organizations or churches or anything else along the way. So for people to entertain themselves, especially those young men, the two things that they did most often was drink and gamble. And that continued up until the 1890s. We do know, and we have one example of early entertainment. There are no Bisbee newspapers and very few references to Bisbee in its early days in the Tucson and Tombstone newspapers as far as its entertainment. I'm being entertained today by Leah, my assistant here. And this one photo we have is of a minstrel. This is a white man in blackface walking down the main street of Bisbee in front of the Can Can Chop House. He's carrying a chair and a musical instrument, and he's obviously going to sit down and play someplace. That's the first reference that we have to early entertainment in Bisbee. Blackface minstrel musicians were a very common form of entertainment in the United States, including the American West back in the 1800s. By the late 1890s, because the Phelps Dodge Corporation had come to town and brought with it modern mining techniques, industrial capitalism, and a railroad, Bisbee went from a dusty, manure-caked streets mining camp to a modern industrialized city. And by the late 1800s, 1890s, I should say, it was a city, a miniature version of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or any other um, modern American city. In the late 1890s, a fellow named Ernest B. Mason, who would also create the Bisbee Water Company, started a roller skating rink. And it was just basically a wooden platform that had a roof over the top of it to keep out the sun and rain. And that was in operation by the mid 1890s. And if you look up on the right hand photograph and look up at the top center of that photograph, you'll see a large white building. That was where the site of the original roller skating rink was, and it later became something else. But this is where the site is of the roller skating rink. It's in back of the old town cemetery, which was right around in here at the western slope of Brewery Gulch. And this is E.B. Mason and his wife. E.B. Mason was a businessman that had a lot of fingers and a lot of pies in Bisbee in the late 1800s. And one of the people that he went into business with was Lemuel Shattuck. And in the late 1880s, or excuse me, late 1890s, Lem Shattuck and E.B. Mason went together to turn the roller skating rink into an opera house. Now, the term opera house in the American West referred to any kind of a performing arts venue. It's kind of a pretentious term, but you'll find San Simon and Bowie had opera houses at one time, as well as Tombstone and Tucson and a lot of other places. Opera was very seldom the type of entertainment that was offered at these places, but they were known as opera houses. And the roller skating rink turned into the Bisbee Opera House, which is located on the very end of Opera Drive, right in back of what is today's City Park in the Brewery Gulch. It was a large white building constructed of lumber, and this was it as far as a place for professional entertainment to come to Bisbee for a number of years. One of the groups that came to Bisbee at that time was Charles Murray and Ollie Mack. And they were professional musicians and comedians who toured the whole country. They spent a lot of time in the American West, and they came here in November 1898. So it wasn't too long after the Opera House opened. And they had musicians, they performed Irish ethnic humor, musical comedy. They stayed together from about 1890 until 1912 when Ollie Mack just got sick of being on the road all the time and decided to go into advertising instead. His partner, Charles Murray, stayed in entertainment business for the rest of his life and transitioned from doing live comedy on stage to working as a comedian in movies, first as silent movies, doing slapstick, and later on, until 1938, he performed in movie comedies. They did Finnegan's Ball. Again, this is a form of ethnic humor that was very, very common in the United States at that time. Just about any ethnic group, whether it was Irish or Italians or Germans or Eastern European Jews, it didn't matter. There was somebody doing comedy about their lifestyle, their manner of speaking, and the Irish were the most common targets of that humor. Most of the time, it was good natured; it wasn't mean. And these two fellas right here kept people in stitches for many, many years. So they were here in 1898. Barney Ferguson was a very popular entertainer. He and another fellow whose name was John Mack. I don't think it was any relation to Ollie Mack, and they were probably both McGillicuddies and shortened to Mack. Performed the same kind of entertainment, and this is Barney Ferguson with John Mack and doing McCarthy's Mishaps. And they toured all over the American West as well. And this was performed at the Opera House in December 1899. And again, this just like the Murray and Mack group, this was in an ensemble. So they would bring their own musicians. They would bring whoever they needed in terms of performing in their in their shows. So they would have other actors and musicians that would assist them. And they were a big hit as well. And Barney Ferguson loved to do Irish parodies. That was what he did. He was Irish. He was born in 1847 in Cork, Ireland, and stayed on the road for most of his life. There's a variety of types of entertainment that were performed in Bisbee in the late 1890s and up in the early years of the 20th century. And you could find just about any genre of entertainment at the Opera House. We have, and I couldn't find much about Griffith, the world's greatest hypnotist, which kind of surprised me because if he's the world's greatest hypnotist, you think there'd be a lot of publicity about him. But we do know he performed all over the American West, and apparently he was very good at what he did. But he combined comedy and hypnotism in his act. And the fellow on the right is Frank Mortimer. And Frank Mortimer was an outstanding juggler. I imagine he had to be pretty darn good at juggling because, as you can see in the photo on the right, he juggled with knives. And if he wasn't very good, he wouldn't still have all 10 of his fingers. When Frank Mortimer got tired of being on the road, he decided to open up an amusement park. He stayed in the entertainment business, but he decided he wanted to be in management instead of actually being on stage. So shortly after the turn of the 20th century, Frank Mortimer started an amusement park in Idaho, and that amusement park stayed in operation for about 30 years. And the great Frank Mortimer, the world's greatest juggler, is how he billed himself, just like Professor Griffith billed himself as the world's greatest hypnotist. Frank was here in April 1899 at the Bisbee Opera House. Rube plays were very, very popular at this time in the United States. And a Rube play involved a sagacious rural character. This is a person who had very little education, so they would speak in dialogue that would indicate that they were pretty unlettered, but they were very, very shrewd and wise. And Uncle John Spruceby was played by a fellow named, let's see, Merle Evans. So that's Uncle Josh and Merle Evans in that role. And what this particular act had that was its shtick, its specialty, was they would perform on stage. The theater bill there is just about what you would see if you went on stage or if you were sitting in front of the stage at the Bisbee Opera House. They would have a real circular saw with a real log set up with a real woman tied on it, and the circular saw would be buzzing away. And this was like the highlight of their act. So as you see, the exciting sawmill scene, I hope they practiced that and rehearsed it so that they didn't have any slip ups, because that could have got pretty messy. By the early 1900s, Uncle Josh was on the road internationally and went over and performed in England. This genre pretty much played itself out in a few years, and we see comments in the newspapers saying that there's just way too many Rube plays around anymore. But they performed at the Opera House, and they were here in 1902 and 1901. One of the favorite plays that was performed all over the West, all over the United States for that matter, was based on Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin Company came to the Bisbee Opera House in 1898, and they performed. They brought dogs with them. They had bloodhounds for the chasing of Elijah across the ice. They had a brass band and this was also a very common form of advertisement, besides having the ads in the paper and handbills up all over town. The day that this company would arrive, and a lot of the other theater companies as well, they would have a brass band that would parade up and down the street. And like a lot of the other performing companies, excuse me while I placate this beast here. Like a lot of the other performing companies, they would travel with a lot of scenery, costumes. They would have a couple of railroad cars, a Pullman car for their company to sleep in, and they'd also have a freight car or part of a freight car to store their scenery and whatever else they needed. In the case of Uncle Josh Spruceby, of course, they'd need to bring a circular saw with them. The American public had a love-hate relationship with Black people at this time. There was sort of the sentimentality about um, Blacks, but there was also a lot of um, feelings that it was very, very important for Black people to stay subservient. So, as we're going to see later on, that the sentimentality was part of it. Making fun of Black people was part of it with minstrel shows, but there was also a mean part that came out in the theater as well, and later on in cinema. The Opera House was also used for local entertainment and local activity. So you could rent it when it wasn't being used for professional touring groups or professional performers of other um, forms. Lodges and fraternal organizations and churches and anybody else locally that needed a place to conduct an event, whether it was fundraising or a dance or anything, could um, rent the Opera House. And as you can see, Methodists used it. Barney Ferguson, there he is, McCarthy's mishap. Um, and a bonbon party. Professor Carson gives in a bonbon party, and it was the first bonbon party given in Bisbee. So free bonbons when you came to the door. That white building disappeared in 1901 and was replaced by a 3-story brick building, a magnificent building, as you can see. This is on the site of Opera Drive, right above where City Park is today. And this building remained in operation for a number of years. And when it shut down, it became the Franklin School and was a school for both Hispanics and then, as they said back in the old days, colored. And it was later torn down. And today you can see the concrete foundations on the side of the gulch, right below the parking lot at the very end of Opera Drive. But it was quite a facility, as you can see. Opera really did come to the Bisbee Opera House, and the Olympia, or the Andrews Opera Company, I should say, performed legitimate opera. They also did operetta. As you can see, they did Carmen and they did Gilbert and Sullivan, the Mikado. So they were based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. They started performing as a family vocal group in 1872, and by the 1880s had turned into a large touring opera company. So they would bring, as you can see, they're doing the Mikado there. They would bring lots and lots of costumes and trunks and lots of scenery. And they would stay for several days and do several performances and then move on to the next city. This is before there was any kind of practical recorded music. Thomas Edison was fooling around with cylindrical recording devices about the time that the Andrews Opera Company came to Bisbee, but there was still, by this time, no real way of providing recorded music. That's going to change very soon when the Edison Company and the Victor Talking Machine Company came out with useful phonographs where people could actually buy music from groups like the Andrews Opera Company and other performers, Enrico Caruso, in the early 1900s. But at this time, if you wanted to hear good music, you had to hear it live on the stage. And these good folks came to Bisbee in March 1901. This was an African American performing group that came to Bisbee in 1901. It was 1898, the original Nashville Students, who, contrary to their name, were neither from Nashville, nor were they students. But at that time, there were the Jubilee Singers that were performing in the United States, and any group of African American performers kind of had to model themselves after the same genre. And so the folks that organized this group of young men and women called themselves Nashville students to kind of legitimize and give themselves a more respectable background. They did spirituals and folk songs, um, unlike the uh, minstrel groups that parodied African Americans. They were legitimate entertainers. They performed serious music. They did plantation songs. They were expected in front of a white audience to sentimentalize the existence of African Americans, about uh, what their life was like in the South. So they would have performed Stephen Collins, Foster songs, and at that time what would be called Negro spirituals. But they didn't roll their eyes. They didn't do the things that minstrels did to um, try to make their performance humorous. They did do some light musical comedy, but it was with dignity. And these folks stayed on the road for many, many years. They performed in Bisbee at the Opera House in 1898. That same year, we start to see, besides phonographs coming out as a new form of entertainment, we also start to see something else. The Lumiere brothers from France had produced a workable, practical, reliable camera, projector, and development device. It was like a 3-in-1 piece of equipment. So you could film scenes or film people, you could develop it, and you could show it all with the same piece of equipment. And as soon as this was developed, it took Europe and America by storm. People were fascinated with the idea that you could see real human beings in real scenery. This is not an artist's rendition. This is the real thing. It captivated people like television did in the 1940s, and like the internet did in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Lumiere brothers brought, not themselves, but their sales reps brought the equipment to the Bisbee Opera House in September 1898. Then they took it to Tucson after that. Um, there were no movies as we would see them today at this time. Basically, what people were doing who had equipment like this, whether it was the Edison Company sales reps or the Lumiere brothers, was that they would actually film scenes in Bisbee, develop the film, and show it to people, and it would just absolutely astound them. They also brought their own film stock, and what they had for the showing at the Bisbee Opera House. Spanish Civil War was going on. It just ended. So they had pictures of the Maine smoldering in Havana Harbor and other scenes from the Spanish American War. But they would also just show like scenes of people walking on the streets in New York City or other places that were well known, or ships, or something else that um, would be pretty mundane to us today. But at that time, what they produced, just those scenes, without any kind of a narrative, without any kind of a way to string them all together, a thematic treatment, just absolutely captivated audiences. And the Opera House started showing these on a fairly regular basis. Whenever anybody would come to town with a movie projector, they'd book them at the Opera House. So what we start seeing also that was really, really interesting at that time was sports. So boxing matches were filmed and then shown, and of course that appealed a great deal to um, men. But they would also start showing other things and start doing very, very short thematic performances, hardly worthy of being called movies, but things where people could see an event being recorded or people being recorded doing a specific thing. And the very first movie, of course, and anybody that studied film history knows that the Edison Company provided the first, what we would call a movie today. It was a piece of film. It was a short. It was one reeler. just a few minutes long, but it was a documentary of a train robbery that actually took place, and they recreated the train robbery, and it was a huge hit. Um, from start to finish, showed the robbery being planned, carried out, and it was something that sold out wherever they would show it. So it had actors, it had a plot, it had dialogue, it had action. It was the very first movie, 1903, and it showed that year at the Bisbee Opera House. This was another company, a traveling musical company, the Olympia Company, that came to Bisbee in 1898. And this particular company right here specialized in light opera. So they did Gilbert and Sullivan. They did other operetta as well. And when they came to Bisbee, they sold out. A lot of companies would come and perform for several days. They'd perform one show on one day and another show on another day. So until they finished whatever their length of stay in town was, but they would have a different show every night. And this company had 40 performers, which is a pretty substantial group. So you can imagine having to find housing for folks like this, having to set up the stage to have 40 people performing. This was not a very large stage, much smaller, for example, than the Bisbee High School stage today, or the stage closer to the stage that used to be and may sometime be used again at the Bisbee Royale. But this was quite a deal. And this is another group that would tour all over the country, and you could pay 50 cents, 75 cents for a front row seat to see this great performance. Now, consider also that there is no amplification of the voices at this time. So these folks had to have loud, powerful voices to be able to reach everybody in the auditorium, wherever it was. If it was a large venue, there was no way to amplify their voices. They just had to belt it out. This was a form of ethnic entertainment that was very popular in the U.S. as well, particularly in Bisbee, because Bisbee had a large ethnic population of Canadians, of Brits, of Scots, of Irishmen. About 20% of Bisbee's population was English-speaking immigrant at that time. So the Kilties came several times to the Bisbee Opera House to perform. And they brought a large ensemble too. They had, according to this bill, 40 musicians, a vocal choir, and you can see the Highland dancers there in their kilts and Glengarries and sporrans and all the other accoutrements that the Scots would wear. And the prices were pretty reasonable. So $1.50 for the front row, and they were very, very popular in Bisbee. This absolutely fascinated me, and her story is a fascinating one. This is Cissy Retta Jones. She was born in Virginia, moved with her family at a very early age to Rhode Island, which was probably one of the best places in the country at that time for African Americans to live. As I'm sure most folks know who have any kind of working knowledge of American history, life for people of color in the United States, even after emancipation and the Civil War, was very, very difficult. Segregation was in existence everywhere. It was more stringently enforced, of course, in the South with Jim Crow laws, but it was, if not de jure, not legal in the rest of the United States. It most certainly was practiced, whether it was legal or not, and it was very much practiced in Bisbee. She toured the United States from the 1890s up until about 1920, and she also toured South America and Europe. She was incredibly popular. She was one of the finest soprano vocalists in the world. and she was billed as the greatest singer of her race. And I would contend that she's probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, singers of the human race at that time. The fascinating thing about her was she was referred to as Black Potty after the premier at that time female vocalist Avelina Potty, who was a soprano from Italy. And as you can see on the right, she wore medals that were given to her all over South America, the United States, and Europe. She disappeared from history. There are no recordings of this woman. Evidently, she wasn't considered to be marketable as a vocalist. Now, by the time she hit her stride in the early teens, or excuse me, early 1900s, so she was probably at her most popular about 1905 to 1910. Sissy Retta Jones should have been recording, but nobody put her on either the Edison label or the Columbia label or the Victor label or any of the other recording labels at that time. So we don't know what she sounded like. But every time a review would appear in a newspaper, the reviewers would be astounded at the quality and power and purity of her voice. So she performed in Bisbee twice, 1907 and 1905. Or no, excuse me, 1907 and 1909. She appeared at the Bisbee Opera House first, and then she appeared at the Orpheum Theater the second time around. And concert bands were very, very popular forms of entertainment at this time. And the Ellery Band was a very, very successful performing band. They did show tunes, they did opera, they did military marches, any kind of music that you would hear, whether it was sentimental or uh, popular music, would be performed by them. And their band leader was Francesco Ferrulo, who had a reputation for histrionics when he was conducting in front of the band. And you can see the examples of some of the gestures that he would make. And he, again, was very, very popular when he came to the Opera House. Long before Magic Kenny Bang Bang, Bisbee was blessed with having the great Zamlock come to perform at the Opera House. Anton Zamlock was from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, emigrated to the United States in the 1860s, toured the American West for decades. He also performed on the East Coast. He performed in Hawaii, Canada, and Mexico. He performed before King David Kalakaua of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Like Magic Kenny Bang Bang, he was a prestidigitator, a sleight of hand artist who could do card tricks, who could pull birds out from underneath people's hats, who could make an omelet in a top hat. He did all kinds of incredible tricks. He was also, like Magic Kenny Bang Bang, someone who billed himself as a spiritualist. So he could contact the dead. He did what they called spiritual knocking, which was in order to contact someone from the departed world. They would knock several times, yes or no, sort of like a audio Ouija board. And he stayed on the circuit, working all over the American West up until the 1920s. His son Carl became a Major League Baseball player, pitched for the Detroit Tigers, and was later the coach for the University of California Golden Bears, but was also a very skilled musician or magician in his own right. So the great Zamlock would have been fascinating to see. And Magic Kenny Bang Bang is carrying on in the Gulch today in the same great tradition. And he toured with several assistants. He had a whole box car full of equipment. A lot of these professional entertainers traveled with large amounts of stage scenery and equipment because they knew when they came to a community like Bisbee, they better bring it with them, because if they didn't have it, they weren't going to have it there. And in 1906, the Bisbee Opera House that was located on Opera Drive was out of business, at least temporarily. Um, and there was a plan made to produce a much, much larger and greater opera house right in back of where and above where the present day Copper Queen Library is located. This was going to seat about 2,500 people. This was going to be the greatest opera house in the Southwest. And this is a period of time when Bisbee was really booming. And there was copper money being made here, hand over fist, new mines opening all the time, lots and lots of people coming to town. And so this looked like a pretty good idea, that they were making a smart business move, the folks that planned to do this, Mr. Manahan, A.L. Manahan, and his business associates, that this would be a great way to make money and put Bisbee on the map by having the premier performing arts venue in the entire Southwest. I think somebody must have sat down with them and explained to them that a 2,500 seat theater in a town at that time of less than 20,000 is probably not going to work out really well. So this place was never built. But if you look on the left, it was sort of a Mission Revival Italianate structure. That was what we were going to see here in the Mule Mountains. It would have been fascinating to have something that grand. It would also have been torn down in the 1950s to build Highway 80, had it actually been constructed. So maybe it was a good idea that was never. In 1907, a new performing arts venue was erected at the very mouth of Brewery Gulch, and this was the Orpheum Theater. And at this time, vaudeville was a common form of entertainment in all over the United States, and vaudeville consisted of circuits of theaters where performers, and it was a variety type of entertainment. So you might have musicians and dancers and jugglers and hypnotists and comedians and animal acts, all kinds of things. It'd be a series of short acts that would appear on the same bill on a given night. Very fast change in between the acts. The MC would come out and do a short patter of entertainment while the next act was getting ready to appear on the stage. And this would go on several days in a town such as Bisbee, and then move on to another town in the vaudeville circuit. Bisbee was on the Orpheum circuit, hence the name Orpheum Theater. There were Orpheum theaters all over Arizona. The Orpheum Theater in Phoenix still exists. And the Orpheum circuit consisted of some of the finest entertainment in the country. Another vaudeville performing circuit that came to Arizona was the Keith Circuit, which had theaters in Douglas and other places in Arizona. The Orpheum Circuit was all over southern Arizona and also had theaters up in central Arizona as well. As soon as this theater opened in its exact form of Gore Park today, and for those who've lived in Bisbee long enough, we all remember Gore, the Gore Garage, it was owned by the Gore family, on exactly the same spot. This was the theater. It was built by the Trost Company. This was not designed by Trost, the architect himself, but it was designed by his associates. So it was a beautiful building, and it was 2 stories and had that large door in the opening. So it was facing out towards where the railroad depot and Phelps Dodge Mercantile was located. This is the interior of the Orpheum Theater. And look how those people are packed in there. Now consider that this is before aluminum chlorhydrate, the active ingredient deodorant, was invented. So let's hope that all these people had a good bath before they came to the theater. This was common at the Orpheum. They had sellout crowds on a regular basis. So these people are packed in there like sardines, both the balcony and the first floor. The balcony was used for overflow. There was no fire escape originally. Can you imagine what would happen if the fire had taken place? You can see how it was wedge shaped by the photograph. And the stage wasn't that large either. And this is, and I'm not sure whether this is the Orpheum or the Bisbee Opera House, but that's Charles Alden on the left with the clarinet. And Charlie Alden was a very, very well-known figure in the entertainment world in Arizona for a number of years. And he was the head of the Theater Owners Association in Southern Arizona in the 1920s and 30s, but he started in Bisbee. So these folks would have been the house orchestra. So if music was needed, but there wasn't an accompanying musical group with whatever act was coming into town, these guys would take care of the music. The Orpheum's opening night featured Edna McDonald, and this was a group that this was vaudeville, and so they had Murphy and Francis was the one group. Edna McDonald was a singer. Murphy and Francis were a Irish comedy act, and they provided illustrated songs, so they would project the lyrics for the song onto a screen, and the house band would play the music, and people were expected to sing along with it. So it was sort of like a participatory entertainment. And please note, when the Orpheum opened in 1907, moving pictures. Movies were already starting to intrude into the entertainment program at places like the Orpheum and the Bisbee Opera House and at other theaters as well. So from the time that The Great Train Robbery, which was a one reel short movie, was released in 1903, we start seeing two-reelers and three-reelers, longer movies with more elaborate plots. We start seeing actors and actresses being publicized, so that it wasn't just about the photo play, as they were called in those days, the movie. It was about who was starring in it. We start seeing movie stars, actual personalities being promoted and advertised. And this is starting to compete with live entertainment. And minstrel shows were very, very common. And you can see that's Gorton's Minstrels. They appeared in Bisbee on a couple of occasions. And this is the Opera House stage right there. And you can see these are white actors in blackface. White women would not have performed on a stage with actual black men, but they could be up there with white men performing in blackface. The way that minstrel shows worked, there was a MC called the interlocutor. There were characters such as Mr. Tambo and Mr. Bones, and they would have all kinds of short performances during the main performance. And then at the end, everyone would get together and perform something called the olio, grand performance at the very end. It was done with parody dialect, so mispronounced words, rolling of eyes, exaggerated behavior that white people thought exemplified the behavior of actual black people. It was pretty racist and pretty disgusting. But this was a very, very common form of entertainment for whites. And when black performers performed on stages in a lot of venues, they were required to wear blackface themselves, which was pretty bizarre. And this is a good example of what a white performer looked like when he was on the stage doing blackface. That's Billy Van, the W.H. West Minstrels. Motion pictures were becoming more and more popular as the first decade of the 20th century progressed. And what you see on the right is one of the very earliest newsreels showing the after effects of the 1903 San Francisco earthquake. And that's the bill for the Bisbee Opera House there on the right, and it shows some of the things that they showed on the screen. So as this decade progressed from 1903, when the Great Train Robbery came out, until 1910, you start to see more movies being shown. Usually, originally, they were shorts in between live acts, but as time progresses, you start to see movies taking over more and more, and live entertainment taking over or having less and less space on the bill. This theater, the Theater Royale or Theater Royal or the Royal Theater, depending on what year it was, opened at 55 Main in the early decade. And it was part of the Iris Theater chain. And it competed with the Opera House and the Orpheum Theater in the Gulch. And you can see there the box office for the Royal Theater. This was one of the most disturbing things I found as far as live entertainment in Bisbee, and this was The Klansman. It was a book that was written glorifying the birth of the Ku Klux Klan to counteract the evil effects of Reconstruction after the Civil War, about how Black people were being put into positions of responsibility and suppressing white people and causing outraging or raping white women. So this was actually performed on stage in Klan uniforms. This was shortly before the Ku Klux Klan was reborn in Stone Mountain, Georgia in 1915. But this is giving an idea of the kind of racism that existed in the United States. And there was a parade in Klan uniform down the street to advertise this play. The Arnhem Stock Theater, and these folks did off-Broadway performances, and this was a legitimate form of theater. This was not burlesque, this was not operetta, this was not vaudeville, this was legitimate uh, uh, theater. And they came to Bisbee on a number of occasions. So you know, all kinds of variety of entertainment, from legitimate theater, Broadway theater, to minstrel shows going on at the same time. And in 1909, two men, and this on the left is Roscoe Conklin Arbuckle, and on the right, Walter Chapman Reed. They were vaudeville performers who worked in California and were booked at the Orpheum Theater in May 1909 for a 1 week stint of performances. They were such a hit, they were held over for 7 months. This is the only time I could find in the history of Bisbee live performance or live entertainment where someone was held over for anywhere near that length of time. So they must have been very, very popular, very, very skilled. Roscoe Arbuckle, despite his girth, was acrobatic. He had a very, very fine singing voice. And the two of these men would do musical comedies, one act musical comedies, a different one each week. So they must have had the music and the scripts sent to them on a regular basis. They had to rehearse the next play or musical play that they were doing, musical comedy, while they were performing another one. And this went on week after week after week. And Roscoe was also just a wildly popular with Bisbee people. Think of Doug Stanhope, and he probably was as popular with people as Doug Stanhope was today, or more popular. He umpired baseball games. He went down to Warren Ballpark to watch the games because it was the same year that Warren Ballpark was built. And this is one of the plays that Reed and Arbuckle. Reed got top billing at this time, and 10 songs that they had to rehearse and comedy each week. So these guys were disciplined, skilled performers. They continued on the stage at the Orpheum until after Christmas. And they had a going away big performance, and everybody was sad to see them go. Their next stop was Globe, and then they went back to California. And then Roscoe went into movies and became Fatty Arbuckle. And by 1918, Roscoe was the second biggest grossing performer doing slapstick comedy after Charles Chaplin. So this guy was really, really popular. These are his mug shots in 1921. Over Labor Day, he rented a suite in San Francisco, had a big party. A woman died at the party. He had nothing to do with her death, but he was still accused of murder and was tried several times until finally a jury said, in hung juries, and um, the prosecutor would retry him again. And finally, the jury said not guilty and sent him a formal note of apology. Despite the fact he was acquitted, and the jury said, you had nothing to do with this, and we're sorry that this case ever came to us. His career was ruined, and he was kept out of. This was the time when there was a big reaction to the excesses and the decadence of Hollywood. So Roscoe was kind of the scapegoat, a brilliant performer. Loved to have seen him on the stage. The Star Theater opened in the Schmidt Block in 1911. The Schmidt Block was the building attached on the north side of the brewery, the Stock Exchange building, and where the big parking lot is today. And the Star Theater is right there. And across the street from it at that time was the Lyric Theater. So the Lyric also started on Brewery Gulch. We found these photos in the collection in Bisbee, and it was Mary Pickford, or supposedly Mary Pickford, although we can find no evidence that Mary Pickford was ever in Bisbee or that she made a movie here. That's definitely School Hill in the background. That's definitely the Copper Queen Hotel. And that's definitely the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad. And that sure as heck looks like Mary Pickford. So did she make a Western movie here? We're still trying to figure that one out. Well, wouldn't that be cool to find out that she did? She was married, of course, to Douglas Fairbanks, America's sweetheart, top drawing female movie star in America during the time around World War I until the early 20s. This movie was based on The Klansman. This was D.W. Griffith that made this movie. It was based on that book about glories of the Ku Klux Klan. And they were afraid to show it here because they were afraid it was going to anger people so much that they would attack Bisbee black residents. The Lyric went from Brewery Gulch to Naco Road, or as we say down home, Naco Road, in February 1917, and is still there. The streetcars would wait outside on this part of the streetcar line because there was so much going on in Brewery Gulch with the Orpheum Theater and the Opera House and everything else that during the evenings they would have more than one streetcar waiting out there to take people back to wherever they were going, Old Bisbee, Warren, Lowell, after the theaters closed. And the Lyric was part of the Diamos change. It was a pretty nice theater during its glory years. The Orpheum closed in 1918 when the Orpheum circuit disbanded in Arizona and reopened as the Grand Theater. And then later it became the Gore Garage. Charlie Chaplin played at the Orpheum, and now we're getting to the point about 1916, 1918, when movies became the dominant form of entertainment, and you start to see less and less live entertainment in all the theaters. So we start to see, instead of vaudeville or performing artists on the stage, although they still came, it was less and less, and finally became almost non-existent in the late 20s. And these were some of the greatest names in Hollywood. And they're performing at the Orpheum, at the Royal, at all the theaters in Bisbee, the Central Theater, the Eagle Theater, which was where the Royal Theater was. And now we get to the point where we can see what happened to these theaters. Where are they today? Now there's 55 Main, and that's the Royal Theater right there, same building. And there's the arches, and the box office was right here. It has been turned into, of course, a store, gallery. Lowell Theater, now a construction company. The Orpheum became the Gore Garage and is now Gore Park. To me, the saddest thing about all these grand theaters is that there is nothing, even the commemorative plaque that's in Gore Park just talks about Brewery Gulch, but doesn't mention anything about this great old theater that used to exist there. This needs to be corrected. I hope you're listening, city fathers and mothers. The Schmidt Building, and this was built by Jacob Schmidt, a Swiss immigrant who came and was a prominent merchant in Bisbee, was torn down in 1938 and turned into a parking lot. I know we need the parking, but this was a beautiful building. And the Opera House is now a parking lot. That's at the very end of Opera Drive. Again, there's no commemorative sign or plaque or anything to indicate this thing ever existed. If you didn't know it was there, you just passed it by. But if you looked out on the side of where the parking lot is, you see the foundations, that's what's left of this magnificent building. And that's pretty much the story. Live entertainment, there was plenty of it and good quality entertainment in Bisbee from the 1890s until about 1920. It was replaced by motion pictures, and now those theaters are gone as well. So if anybody has any comments, anything that they would like to ask, anything that we can do to help elucidate this, please let us know.
Wow, Mike, that was incredible. Thank you so much for that. I know you and I chatted briefly about how really very little is known about this aspect of Bisbee's history, and I truly appreciate you diving in for our audience. And I also appreciate Leah, your work from home supervisor, Leah the cat, making sure that you gave us correct information.
What she's waiting to do is to get a slice of turkey.
Ah.
That's what the whole thing was about. And she's also my worst critic. So if I didn't do a good job today, I'm going to hear about
it. Good deal. We do have quite a few questions.
Okay.
I'm actually going to jump in and ask you the first question, something I'm curious about. Growing up, I had always heard Harry Houdini had played, or I'm sorry, performed in Bisbee. Were you able to find any evidence of that?
It's an urban legend. Harry Houdini never came to Bisbee. Sorry, Magic Kenny Bang Bang. He wasn't here.
Ah, that's a bummer.
But the great Zamlock, I think, could have given Harry Houdini a run for his money.
All right. The next question is from Mark. He asks, how were these artists booked in Bisbee or other Western cities with no
Good
internet,
question.
email, or even consistent phones? Did they have agents?
They had agents, but a lot of them were also on circuits, and the theater circuit they were on would do the booking for them. The way it worked was there an advanced person for the bigger acts would come to town, make sure that everything was taken care of ahead of time. For the smaller acts, they were pretty much on their own, and they used the telegraph. And then, of course, as time went on, telephones were available, but there must have been a lot of pulling of hair and bad words used when things didn't mesh together, or in the case of traveling on railroads, if you had a washout or a railroad strike or anything else, you could end up having your act canceled, and you didn't get paid if you didn't work. So it was a difficult experience. But yes, the arrangements were made ahead of time through telegraph or letter, and agents would be used in order to make the arrangements, or in the case of the vaudeville circuits, the vaudeville companies themselves would do that.
And one of your slides may have answered this question, but what was the capacity of the Opera House and the Orpheum?
The Orpheum could handle 700 to 900 people, depending on whether the balcony was being used. And we don't know the exact capacity of the Opera House, but it was several hundred. So these were large theaters.
And during showings of entertainment like the Klansmen, were there any protests against it in person, in print, or in oral histories of Bisbee?
I don't think so. The reason why the city fathers were reticent to have the Klansmen shown here, they were worried about a white riot because this was a time when race riots were fairly common in the United States, but they weren't like the Watts riots or Detroit riots of the 1960s, where black people were just fed up with being beaten by the police or treated as second class citizens. This was white people doing a beat down on black people for no good reason other than blatant racism. So I don't think there was a protest. We don't have any understanding today of how prevalent and virulent racism was in the United States at that time. I wish people recognized that. There were about 100 black adults living in Bisbee at that time, most of them living in Brewery Gulch. And I'm sure they were fearful for their lives when that movie was shown.
And just as a side note, in a 1917 mining journal, Walter Douglas plainly states, quote, "We are a white man's camp."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Our next question, are you familiar with Ted DeGrazia's connection to the lyric? And could you elaborate? He managed it when he first moved here with a new wife.
He did. He married into the Diamos family. And if you'll recall, I mentioned that the Diamos family owned the Lyric theater chain that existed all over southern Arizona. They had theaters in Douglas, Bisbee, Tucson, Nogales. And he married one of the Diamos uh, family women, and he managed the Bisbee Lyric Theater in the late 30s and early 40s. And if you go to the DeGrazia Theater or Gallery of the Sun, he's got a wonderful, wonderful painting of the Gulch at night with the Orpheum Theater, which is already gone, but he painted it with using his imagination, showing Bisbee. I got a chance to see that. They got it out for me to look at when I went to the Gallery of the Sun, and I was just absolutely thrilled to see that. Yeah, Ted DeGracia was here. He did some really fine painting while he was here. I think some of them appeared in Arizona Highways magazine not too long ago.
And as a little teaser for our audience, the Muheim Heritage House, as well as the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum, are planning a DeGrazia, pardon me, exhibit for 2025, which
That's
includes works
wonderful.
such as the one that you mentioned.
That's wonderful. I'll be sure to see that, and I would hope that anybody that sees this today, share it with your friends. Ted DeGracia was an incredible artist, and he did some really, really nice stuff on Bisbee. That one painting he did of the Gulch at night is, boy, I wish I had a copy of that to put up in the house.
The next question, would Black entertainers stay with Black residents when they came to town? Do you know?
Absolutely, they had to. They weren't allowed to stay at any hotel that I know of in town. They couldn't eat in restaurants. And this was the way that life was for Black entertainers all over the American West and Black athletes for that matter, too. Jim Crow was stringently enforced all over the United States. I know of no exceptions to that. That is a stain on the American character and our history.
And Bob was wondering if copies of your slides would be available if possible.
For a very, very high price. No, you know, I would be happy to share anything that I have with people. This is something I do. I'm a storyteller. I'm not a person that believes this is mine and you can't have it. So if Bob wants to get a hold of me, he can get my contact information from you. Be happy to share whatever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And where did Bisbee rank among the Western cities during the boom time? Was it something like Denver?
No, we maxed out around the World War One period at 25,000. The old claim that Bisbee was the biggest town between San Francisco and St. Louis, well, yeah, that's after about 60 other cities. If you just start looking at a map, but we were a big city. We were the third largest city in Arizona until the end of World War II, which is pretty astounding. But it wasn't just the population size, it was the wealth of the population. This was a rich city because of the copper production that was going on here. So it attracted professional entertainment of the highest quality. It attracted Major League Baseball teams. This would have been a really interesting place to live, and a place to visit for that matter, to see the kinds of top quality entertainment that we got. It had to do with money. It also had to do with what I call juice, which is political and economic power. That draws entertainment.
And we have numerous compliments about your presentation from Kelly, from Mark, Doug, and eh, Chris Emmons stated, my father-in-law, Bob Gagey, greatly enjoyed spending Saturday afternoons watching movies at the Lyric Theater.
Oh,
And
didn't we all? I'm sorry. I'm sorry that it's closed. And if I can interject something right here, we have no operating theater in Bisbee today. That's pretty sad. I mean, I realize you can go online now and you can watch any movie you care to watch. But wasn't it fun to go to the Lyric and see who else was showing up, regardless of what movie was playing?
indeed. And Christine wanted to mention outstanding review of Bisbee entertainment history. Loved the program. Even Kiwanis would engage theater groups from the East Coast in the late 1920s as a fundraiser. Kiwanis members provide some of the actors and musicians, and even then, blackface was still popular.
And that's a sad reflection on our on how we viewed people of color in those days. Um, it's indeed, the great vaudeville, Burt Williams, one of the greatest, and I love doing his Preacher the Bear routine. It's one of the very, very funniest. I'd do it right now if I had the time. But these people face tremendous discrimination. Um, they go into a town, they don't know what kind of reception they're going to get. And there were mean, nasty racists everywhere in the United States at that time. Still are today.
An unfortunate truth,
Yes.
definitely. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, this was just a fabulous program.
And Annie has a tip jar. So if anybody wants to put Bitcoins or any other form of virtual currency into it, it will be gratefully accepted.
Thank you so much, Mike. Oh, and thank you so much to our audience for joining us today. Again, a copy of the recording of this program will be sent via email in the event you miss part of the program. You'll be able to enjoy that hopefully within a few hours. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a good one. Take care now. Bye.